What do you do when you want to paint loose, but when you try, it just turns into a big ol' mess? In this video, I'm going to walk through 7 strategies that I use to save a painting when it's getting away from me, whether it's because I'm overworking it, the paint is getting too thick and muddy, or the realism is just getting totally lost. My name is Chelsea, and this is what I do. I am a full-time professional oil painter, and I mentor artists who want to master expressive oil painting. If you find the tools that I share in this video helpful and you would like a tailor-made mentorship for reaching your painting goals, check out the links in the description to find out more and apply to see if we are fit to work together. All right, let's dive in, starting with the strategies that I used on this exact painting to save what was starting as a big mess and turn it into something painterly and expressive. So the very first thing that I used when I realized that this painting was going off the rails, that you too are going to want to use for your own painting practice when you run into this problem, is to mock it up. Specifically, it is paramount for me in my own painting practice, and I find this is true for my students as well, to have a really clear vision of what the final painting is actually supposed to look like. So when I started this painting, I actually kicked off with just the raw photo reference that I took for this image, and I thought that it would be good enough to just work off of this image. But once I started actually getting down to business here, I began to second guess my own work. And I was wondering if little adjustments that I was making to my color choices, my value structure, the ways in which I was trying to simplify the horse and the rider, I began to wonder if actually this could even possibly look good. And so as soon as I had this thought, what I went ahead and did is I went into Photoshop, I took my photo reference, and I started manipulating the photo reference until I actually had a really clear idea of what the final painting should look like. And specifically, I made sure that the mock-up itself was something that I felt really satisfied with. In this case, I actually took a photo of the existing painting, and in Photoshop, I used the ability to select just the subject, and I inserted the background that I had already painted into my canvas, and I inserted it behind the subject of the horse and rider, just to see if the existing higher key, very loose, very scumbly background that I had painted in could work. And I found that I actually liked the result more than I thought, which told me that a lot of the second guessing that I was doing wasn't really productive, and I could put my mind at ease and simply follow through with the plan that I had put together here. Now, I did tinker a little bit with the value structure of the horse and rider as well. Because I had actually lifted the value of the background, I knew that it would really help the horse and rider to pop, given that they are quite a bit darker in this image. But at the same time, I didn't want them to look disjointed. And so I did a little bit of tinkering just to make sure that any kind of value adjustments I would make in the actual painting actually looked good in the mock-up itself. So honestly, when I got to the stage of doing this mock-up, I had been painting on this piece for probably a couple of hours and was beginning to feel really discouraged. And the very simple step for me of taking probably no more than 10 minutes to go into Photoshop and put together this mock-up so I could visualize the final painting made me realize that I actually could see this through all the way to the end. I just needed to clean up some drawing issues and keep on going. The second strategy that I used to help me in creating this particular piece that I would also recommend that you put into place for yourself in your own painting practice is to have examples of what you are going for. This is a strategy that I see seriously underutilized, especially in amateur painters who are getting more serious about their craft. I actually see this used quite a bit with professional painters, and it's something that really sets the two apart and makes the professional's job that much easier, which is the professional is really likely, when doing something that maybe is kind of pushing their own limits a little bit or doing something they know is going to be challenging, if they know that it lines up even loosely with an existing painter whose work they really admire, they will pull out examples of that painter's work and either look at them beforehand and study them, complete something like a master copy, or they will keep them out through the duration of the painting as a little bit of a visual guide so that they can go back and forth between looking at their own work and then looking at the master copy to answer questions like, how hard should I make this edge? Does it make sense to compress this value structure and to really work the subject into the background, or vice versa in this location? In my case, it also helped me quite a bit in understanding what process I wanted to use to take the image from like bare canvas to finished product. One thing that I also want to say about having examples of what you're going for is that it isn't enough, in my experience, to just quickly glance over images of your favorite paintings that are maybe done in a similar style to the loose painting that you want to produce. I find that these paintings, these example paintings, are actually being really underutilized. And if you make sure that you actually have images of your favorite paintings up, whether it's like a book that you have open or a print that you have, or you are simply loading up images of that artist's work on your computer next to the easel where you're working, very actively keeping them in your field of vision and being able to quickly compare them to what you are doing and using them as a guide to really show you how would this artist handle something like how soft the edges of the quickly moving legs of the horse should look, or how much detail should I really put in the rider's face. These are questions that I find myself really actively asking when I'm at the easel, and having examples of master artists' work in front of me to help problem solve that and troubleshoot those questions really makes a big difference. So chances are you are not utilizing existing artwork from artists that you look up to who are loose painters nearly as much as you could be. In this case, for this particular painting, I actually created a Pinterest board that consists purely of different equestrian paintings. A lot of them are by Carolyn Anderson, there's some others by Kwang Ho, and I actually organized these roughly by style and subject matter so I could really quickly at a glance see what commonalities these paintings all have. The third strategy that I really want to emphasize is helpful when you realize that you are quickly in dangerous territory of creating a mess instead of a loose painting is to not wing it. There are so many different ways that you can interpret this bit of wisdom, but what I find is most applicable to most painters is that they often pick out a reference to paint from, they sit down and will simply dive in and start painting. And along the way, they will say to themselves, I don't really like this background, but like that's a problem for later in the painting. Or, I kind of wish this were a different color, or the lighting was a different temperature, but like I'll change that somewhere down the line. The reality is that anytime I find myself saying that, or anytime I hear one of my students articulate that, I know that trouble is on the horizon. So at any point, if you realize there are any unanswered questions about how you're going to solve a particular problem, about how you are going to navigate certain nuances of the composition, if there are any changes that you need to make to the reference, this is when it is best to pause, put the brush down, and either return to your mock-up to explore those questions and figure out the best answer, or switch gears and do a painting exercise to warm yourself up so that you understand what process or what technique you actually need to employ to get the results that you want. The fourth strategy that I recommend putting in place, and that definitely came up in this particular painting, is to check your drawing. Check it early and check it often. So going back to the mock-up that I put together for this piece, I realized, honestly, the biggest issue that I was having is that I was just being a little bit careless with some aspects of the drawing. I paint a lot of portraits. I paint the faces of people and of animals, but one thing I don't do nearly as often is paint full figures, whether that's an entire animal or an entire person. And in this case, I was doing both in this composition. And while there are aspects of this painting that came together really intuitively, there were a lot of aspects here that were pretty uncomfortable and that I don't have nearly as much mileage or practice with. Specifically, I very rarely paint backgrounds that have this degree of clarity and scope. I very rarely paint people as small as I did on this 12 by 12 painting. I very rarely paint the overall bodies and limbs of horses, although that's probably the weak spot that is relatively strongest for this particular painting. But because these are newer, I found that I was sort of defaulting to a shorthand here. I was thinking of the rider in very generic stick figure terms. I had some proportion problems that I noticed come up over and over again whenever I actually draw or paint a horse and rider, where the rider becomes usually too large, the head is too large. I'm thinking about their limbs, their arms and legs in a way that is very stick figure-y versus thinking about them more anatomically or as three-dimensional forms. And so, again, as soon as I realized this was going off the rails and I put together my mock-up, the next step that I took was to actually compare the existing painting to the mock-up to see where my drawing was off. Where is my placement of all the major shapes of this painting going astray from the plan that I had put together? I actually have several videos about this on my YouTube channel where I demonstrate a really easy way to check your drawing using a tool like Photoshop. So I will make sure to link those for you to check them out in case you're curious as to how I do this exact process. But when I talk about checking the drawing with the artists that I mentor, one of the things I find myself saying the most often is that the drawing wasn't checked early enough. Oftentimes, the first time an artist checks the drawing is when they are actually submitting it to me for critique, and they could avoid a lot of the back and forth or the questions that come up if they simply use the exact same steps that they used at the end of the drawing or the end of the painting at the beginning. And typically the very best time to do this, in my experience, is before you jump into color or really layering the paint on in any meaningful way. So this could be something where you actually sketch out your subject in pencil on your canvas first, or you use a transfer method, or you do what I do, which is to draw directly with the paintbrush. And oftentimes, problems that I experience in paintings for myself and problems that I see other artists encounter arise when the drawing step is gone through way too hastily, and they dive right into color and they start building the paint up and they start putting detail into areas that ultimately have to be moved. So if you can actually start checking your drawing within the first 10 or 15 minutes of a painting, and you can do everything to make sure all of the key landmarks are actually in place before you progress forward into color or into layering the paint on, you're going to save yourself so much time. And I know this because this was actually the primary problem that I had in this painting that I wound up overcoming. Now, the last 3 strategies that I want to share are not necessarily strategies that you will use in the middle of a painting, but rather things that you can do to set yourself up for success the next time that you paint. And the first of these 3 strategies is to not throw yourself in the deep end. I will fess up to this right now. I absolutely did this in this painting. I was creating an image that was a subject that I don't typically paint. I was tackling 2 different figures, horse and rider. Horses are notoriously a difficult subject to capture accurately as an artist. The human figure is right up there with them. And not only that, but I was painting all of these background elements that I typically simplify or abstract in my other portraits. If I were my own mentee and I happened to be giving myself feedback, I would see if I couldn't find a way to work my way to this level of complexity. You know, maybe that is starting with the full figure of a horse without a rider on a very simplified, vignetted, or abstracted background. Maybe then I would go to horse and rider on that very simplified background. Maybe then I would work on some paintings where I have the full background in there as well as the horse and the rider. There are a lot of ways that you can essentially bridge the gap between what your existing comfort level is and what you're working toward. It doesn't just have to be about the subject matter. It can also be about things like exploring new techniques. And that brings me to the penultimate strategy that you can use to avoid messes in the first place. And that is to use a known process. Use a process for getting the paint on the canvas that you are already really fluent in. This isn't the time to throw yourself in the deep end with something completely new. So in this case, if you are working toward a style that is looser, and that is the main difference between what you've been doing and what you really want to do, and you think this could be contributing to your loose paintings turning out way too messy instead of expressive and painterly, well, if that's the case, we need to find ways to slowly transition you from the process that you're really comfortable with already to the way in which you want to work. You might do this by using something like a pencil drawing to start if that's how you're already comfortable, or if you always work with a grisaille or a tonal underpainting before you go into color, maybe you practice with some of these loose painting techniques in value only before you introduce color. Or in this case, I'm working in a very dry brush, scumbly approach, and I'm used to painting very, very wet into wet. And so what I might do is I might slowly over time shift my way of working to something that is drier and drier, rather than simply asking myself one day to work using a completely new method. And last up, the very final strategy that I would use to avoid messy paintings in the first place is to use master copies to warm up. Master copies are an incredible tool to help you to master new techniques, new subjects, new ways of working, and I find that they're especially useful when you're interested in loose painting. Now, a common misconception that artists have about master copies is that they can only be of old masters who typically paint a little bit tighter. But the reality is that you can create master copies from the works of contemporary artists, provided that you're doing this only for an educational purpose. I know so many prolific, successful, living artists who regularly create master copies from living artists that they're friends with or that they look up to. These are so incredibly useful because they allow us to essentially stand on the shoulders of artists who we already admire and who are very successful in their own work. And whether you are looking to tackle a style like loose expressive painting, or you're looking to master a new technique, or you are looking to master a new subject, oftentimes the very first step that I ask myself is that, can I effectively capture this process or this subject or this style through a master copy where the process has effectively been laid out in front of me? If I can't do that, chances are I'm not going to pull it off successfully in an original painting. But if I can create the master copy, I can probably do it in my own painting. It just is going to require a little bit of fine-tuning and practice to show me how to translate the existing skills that I've used in the master copy into my own work. And there you have it. Here are the 7 key strategies that I use to save paintings when they are starting to turn into a big ol' mess. If you have any questions about what happens when your loose paintings become too loose and you lose the realism altogether, let me know down in the comments, because I would love to speak to those for you and maybe even put them in an upcoming video. And again, if you are looking for help with this journey, whether you want help with this exact issue or you simply want some step-by-step hand-holding to help you to master your desired style of oil painting and reach your biggest painting goals, I have more information on my mentorships down in the description, as well as a link to apply to see if we are fit to work together. All right, until next time, happy painting.